A white police officer pulls over a black man for speeding, making prejudiced assumptions. The man turns out to be a decorated war veteran and a respected judge. The black sedan, a sleek, powerful machine, cut through the desolate highway like a phantom. Its engine hummed a low, resonant tune, a stark contrast to the silence of the night. The speedometer needle danced precariously close to the red line, a silent testament to the driver's urgency. Inside, Thomas, a man of distinguished bearing, his face etched with a quiet intensity, gripped the steering wheel. His eyes, dark and piercing, scanned the road ahead, a mix of determination and apprehension in their depths. Suddenly, a flash of red and blue erupted in the rearview mirror, shattering the tranquility. A siren wailed, its shrill cry echoing through the night, growing louder with each passing second. Thomas's heart pounded against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. He eased his foot off the accelerator, the sedan's powerful engine sighing as it slowed. He pulled over to the side of the road, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. Officer Jackson, his youthful face hardened by an air of authority, stepped out of his patrol car. He adjusted his cap, his eyes fixed on the black sedan. He approached the vehicle with a measured gait, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. A flicker of something, perhaps suspicion, perhaps prejudice, danced in his eyes as he took in the sight of the driver, a black man in an expensive car. License and registration. Jackson's voice was sharp, devoid of any warmth. Thomas, his movements deliberate, reached into his jacket and retrieved his wallet. He handed over his driver's license and registration, his eyes meeting Jackson's. There was no fear in his gaze, only a quiet dignity. Jackson scrutinized the documents, his eyes lingering on Thomas's face. He ran a hand over the smooth leather of the registration, his fingers tracing the embossed letters. He returned the documents to Thomas, his expression unchanged. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," Jackson commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. Thomas hesitated for a moment, a flicker of something, perhaps resignation, perhaps disappointment, crossing his features. He opened the car door and stepped out, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the glare of the headlights. Jackson circled the sedan, his eyes scanning every inch of the vehicle. He peered through the windows, his gaze sweeping across the plush leather seats, the polished dashboard, the gleaming chrome accents. He found nothing amiss. "Do you know why I pulled you over, sir?" Jackson asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "I assume it was for speeding," Thomas replied, his voice calm and steady. "Assume?" Jackson raised an eyebrow. "You were doing 80 in a 55 zone." "I apologize, officer," Thomas said, his voice sincere. "I was a bit preoccupied." "Preoccupied?" Jackson scoffed. "That's no excuse for reckless driving." He paused and looked at Thomas. "Where are you headed this late?" "I was on my way home," Thomas replied. "And where is home?" Jackson asked. Thomas told him his address. Jackson looked at the address and back at Thomas. "And what do you do for a living that allows you to drive such an expensive car, sir?" Jackson asked, his tone laced with skepticism. "I'm a judge," Thomas replied, his voice calm and steady. Jackson's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "A judge, huh? And what court do you preside over?" "The Superior Court," Thomas replied. Jackson's eyes narrowed. He looked at Thomas, his gaze searching for any sign of deception. He saw none. "I'm going to run your information, sir," Jackson said, his voice clipped. "Please wait here." He returned to his patrol car and sat behind the wheel. He typed Thomas's name and driver's license number into the computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The screen flickered, and Thomas's information appeared. Jackson's eyes scanned the screen, his gaze lingering on the details. He saw Thomas's date of birth, his address, his occupation. He saw his military record, his commendations, his medals. He saw his picture, a dignified portrait of a man in a black robe, his eyes filled with wisdom and compassion. A wave of shame washed over Jackson. He had made a snap judgment, based on nothing more than the color of Thomas's skin and the make of his car. He had treated him with suspicion and disrespect, simply because he was black. He looked at Thomas, who stood patiently by the side of the road, his face calm and composed. He saw not a criminal, but a man of honor, a man of integrity, a man who had served his country with distinction. Jackson stepped out of his patrol car, his head bowed in shame. He approached Thomas, his footsteps heavy. "Sir," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm so sorry. I made a mistake. I shouldn't have stopped you." Thomas looked at Jackson, his eyes filled with understanding. "It's all right, officer," he said, his voice gentle. "We all make mistakes." "No, sir," Jackson insisted. "It's not all right. I judged you based on the color of your skin. That's not right." "I appreciate your honesty, officer," Thomas said. "But I assure you no harm was done." "But it could have been," Jackson said. "I could have arrested you. I could have ruined your reputation." "But you didn't," Thomas said. "You recognized your mistake, and you apologized. That's what matters." Jackson looked at Thomas, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, sir," he said. "Thank you for understanding." "You're welcome, officer," Thomas said. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a long drive ahead of me." "Of course, sir," Jackson said. He stepped aside, allowing Thomas to return to his car. Thomas got into the sedan and started the engine. He looked at Jackson, a faint smile playing on his lips. He nodded, then pulled away from the curb, the powerful engine roaring to life. Jackson watched as the sedan disappeared into the night, its taillights fading into the darkness. He stood there for a moment, his mind filled with a mix of shame, regret, and gratitude. He had made a mistake, a big one, but he had also learned a valuable lesson. He returned to his patrol car and sat behind the wheel. He looked at the computer screen, Thomas's information still displayed. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He had a lot to think about. The glow of the patrol car's computer screen illuminated Jackson's face, casting stark shadows that danced with the flickering cursor. He scrolled through Thomas's digital profile, each line of text a revelation, a stark contrast to the assumptions he had so readily made. The name Thomas Maxwell echoed in his mind, no longer just a name on a driver's license, but a weight of responsibility, a testament to a life lived with purpose. He lingered on the section detailing Thomas's military service. The images flashed before his eyes. Thomas, younger, leaner, his face etched with the grit of combat, receiving a bronze star, a purple heart, his eyes reflecting the horrors of war, yet holding a steely resolve. He saw Thomas, not as the man he had just pulled over, but as a hero, a patriot, a man who had risked everything for his country. Then he moved to the judicial section. Judge of the Superior Court. The title read, bold and undeniable. Jackson's heart sank. He pictured the courtroom, the solemnity of the proceedings, the weight of justice resting on Thomas's shoulders. He imagined Thomas, not as the man he had just questioned, but as a pillar of the community, a guardian of the law, a symbol of fairness. A wave of nausea washed over Jackson. He recalled his words, his tone, his thinly veiled accusations. How could he have been so blind, so prejudiced? He had treated a man of such stature with disrespect, simply because of the color of his skin. The shame was a bitter taste in his mouth, a burning sensation in his chest. He remembered the look in Thomas's eyes, a mixture of disappointment and weary understanding. There was no anger, no resentment, only a quiet sadness, a silent indictment of Jackson's prejudice. That look cut deeper than any insult, any accusation. Jackson closed his eyes, the images of Thomas's life flashing before him. He saw Thomas as a young boy, growing up in a segregated neighborhood, facing discrimination and prejudice at every turn. He saw Thomas as a young man, determined to overcome those obstacles, to prove his worth, to make a difference. He saw Thomas as a lawyer, fighting for justice, defending the rights of the marginalized, challenging the status quo. He saw Thomas as a judge, upholding the law, ensuring fairness, dispensing justice with wisdom and compassion. He opened his eyes, the screen now a blur of light and text. He had seen enough. He had seen the man behind the image, the human being behind the stereotype. He had seen the consequences of his own prejudice, the damage it could inflict, the injustice it could perpetuate. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions raging within him. He had to make amends. He had to apologize. He had to acknowledge his mistake. He stepped out of the patrol car, his legs feeling heavy, his steps hesitant. He approached Thomas, who stood patiently by the side of the road, his face calm, his posture erect. The air crackled with tension, the silence broken only by the hum of the passing traffic. "Sir," Jackson began, his voice barely a whisper, I've seen your record." Thomas nodded, his eyes fixed on Jackson's. "I know who you are," Jackson continued, his voice trembling. "I know what you've done. I know what you represent." Thomas remained silent, his gaze unwavering. "I'm so sorry, sir," Jackson said, his voice choked with emotion. "I made a terrible mistake. I judged you based on the color of your skin. I treated you with disrespect. I'm ashamed." He paused, searching for the right words, the words that could convey the depth of his remorse. "I know an apology isn't enough," he said, his voice barely audible. "But I hope you can understand. I hope you can forgive me." Thomas looked at Jackson, his eyes filled with compassion. "Officer," he said, his voice gentle, "I appreciate your honesty. I understand that you made a mistake. We all do. What matters is that you recognized it, that you're willing to learn from it." "But, sir," Jackson protested, I could have ruined your reputation. I could have arrested you. I could have." "But you didn't," Thomas interrupted, his voice firm. "You chose to do the right thing. You chose to admit your mistake. That speaks volumes about your character." Jackson was taken aback by Thomas's words. He had expected anger, resentment, perhaps even retribution. But instead, he was met with understanding, forgiveness, and even a hint of respect. "Thank you, sir," Jackson said, his voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you for not pressing charges. Thank you for not making this worse than it already is." "There's no need for that," Thomas said. "I believe in second chances." I believe in redemption. And I believe that you've learned a valuable lesson tonight." He paused, his eyes searching Jackson's. "But remember, officer," he said, his voice firm, "this lesson comes with a responsibility to treat everyone with respect, regardless of their race, their background, their social status. A responsibility to uphold the law, not just in word, but in spirit. A responsibility to be a force for justice, not for prejudice." Jackson nodded, his eyes filled with determination. "I understand, sir," he said. "I won't forget." Thomas smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. "I know you won't," he said. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a long drive ahead of me." He turned and walked towards his car, his steps purposeful, his posture erect. Jackson watched him go, a sense of awe washing over him. He had just encountered a man of extraordinary character, a man who had transformed a moment of potential conflict into a lesson of profound significance. The taillights of the black sedan receded into the darkness, leaving Jackson standing alone on the desolate stretch of highway. The night air was cool, a stark contrast to the heat that had been building within him throughout the encounter. He felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, shame, and a burgeoning sense of change. He returned to his patrol car, the interior now feeling alien, almost hostile. The computer screen, once a tool of authority, now seemed to mock him with its display of Thomas Maxwell's distinguished profile. He shut it down, the sudden darkness a welcome respite. He leaned back in his seat, his mind replaying the events of the past hour. He had been so quick to judge, so eager to assert his authority. He had allowed his preconceived notions to dictate his actions, to cloud his judgment. He had almost made a terrible mistake. He thought of Thomas's words, his calm demeanor, his unwavering dignity. There was no trace of anger or resentment in his voice, only a quiet understanding, a gentle rebuke. He had been given a second chance, a chance to learn, to grow, to change. He started the engine, the low hum a comforting sound in the silence. He pulled back onto the highway, his headlights cutting through the darkness. The road stretched out before him, an endless ribbon of asphalt, a metaphor for the journey ahead. He drove in silence, his thoughts swirling, his mind grappling with the implications of the encounter. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, a fair cop. But tonight, he had seen a different side of himself, a side he didn't like. He thought of his training, the countless hours spent learning the law, the procedures, the protocols. But nothing had prepared him for this, for the subtle, insidious nature of prejudice. He had been taught to see the world in black and white, to categorize people based on their appearance, their background, their circumstances. But Thomas Maxwell had shattered that simplistic worldview. He arrived back at the precinct, the familiar surroundings now imbued with a new sense of unease. He parked his patrol car and walked into the station, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glare on the faces of his colleagues. He nodded to a few officers, but his mind was elsewhere. He went to his locker and changed out of his uniform, the weight of the badge feeling heavier than usual. He walked out of the station, the cool night air a welcome relief. He got into his car and drove home, the streets of the city passing by in a blur. He arrived at his apartment, a small, cramped space that had always felt like a sanctuary. Tonight it felt like a prison. He turned on the lights, the harsh glare reflecting off the bare walls, the sparse furniture. He walked into the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water, the cold liquid a soothing balm to his parched throat. He sat down at the kitchen table, the silence broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. He thought of his family, his parents, his siblings. They had always taught him the importance of fairness, of equality, of treating everyone with respect. But somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of those values. He thought of his community, the people he had sworn to protect. He had always believed that he was making a difference, that he was helping to make the world a better place. But tonight, he had seen how easily he could become part of the problem. He got up from the table and walked into the living room. He turned on the television, the flickering images a distraction from his thoughts. He flipped through the channels, but nothing held his attention. He turned off the television and walked to the window. He looked out at the city, the lights twinkling in the distance, the sounds of the night filtering through the glass. He felt a sense of isolation, a sense of disconnection. He went to his bedroom and lay down on the bed, the mattress feeling lumpy and uncomfortable. He closed his eyes, but sleep eluded him. His mind was racing, his thoughts churning. He thought of Thomas Maxwell, his face etched with dignity, his eyes filled with compassion. He thought of his words, his wisdom, his forgiveness. He thought of the lesson he had learned, the shift in his perspective. He drifted off to sleep, his dreams filled with images of Thomas Maxwell, of the highway, of the flashing lights of the patrol car. He woke up the next morning feeling drained, but also strangely renewed. He went through his morning routine, the familiar motions now imbued with a new sense of purpose. He got dressed, had breakfast, and left for work. He arrived at the precinct, the atmosphere still charged with the events of the previous night. He walked into the briefing room, the eyes of his colleagues following him. He took his seat, the silence heavy. The briefing began, the usual routine of updates, assignments, and reminders. But Jackson's mind was elsewhere. He was thinking of Thomas Maxwell, of the lesson he had learned. He went out on patrol, his senses heightened, his awareness sharpened. He saw the city with new eyes, a city of diversity, of complexity, of humanity. He saw the people he had sworn to protect, not as statistics, not as stereotypes, but as individuals, as human beings. He stopped a car for a traffic violation, a routine encounter that would have once filled him with a sense of power. But today, he approached the situation with a newfound humility, a newfound respect. He spoke to the driver, a young man who looked nervous, intimidated. He listened to his explanation, his voice calm, his tone reassuring. He issued a warning, not a ticket, and sent the driver on his way. He continued his patrol, his actions guided by a new sense of purpose. He stopped a group of teenagers who were loitering in a park, not to harass them, but to engage them in conversation, to build a rapport. He responded to a call for a domestic disturbance, a situation that could have easily escalated into violence. But he approached the situation with a sense of calm, a sense of empathy, a sense of understanding. He spent the day interacting with people from all walks of life, from all backgrounds, from all circumstances. He saw the world through a new lens, a lens of compassion, a lens of understanding. He returned to the precinct at the end of his shift, feeling a sense of satisfaction, a sense of accomplishment. He had made a difference, not in a grand, heroic way, but in a small, meaningful way. He went home, his apartment now feeling like a sanctuary. He made dinner, watched some television, and went to bed. He slept soundly, his dreams peaceful, his mind at rest. He woke up the next morning feeling refreshed, renewed, and ready to face the day. He had changed, not overnight, but gradually, subtly, profoundly. He was a different cop, a different person. He was a better cop, a better person. If this story resonated with you, Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel to support more powerful storytelling like this. And don't stop there. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next video. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below to let us know how this story impacted you or what you'd like to see next. Your feedback helps us create meaningful content that connects with you. Thank you for being a part of our community. Your voice matters,